A pastor finds a black baby in a dumpster, abandoned and alone. He raises the child as his own, never expecting the secrets buried within the boy's past. 10 years later, the truth about the boy's identity comes crashing down. Who is this child, and how will his truth reshape the pastor's life? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Pastor John wheeled his shopping cart down the cereal aisle of Miller's Grocery, his mind running through Sunday's sermon notes. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he reached for a box of Mary's favorite granola. The evening was winding down and the store was nearly empty. A faint sound caught his attention. He paused, tilting his head. There it was again, a cry, weak but unmistakable, coming from somewhere outside the building's back wall. "Did you hear that?" he asked Betty, the elderly cashier who was restocking the candy display. She shook her head, her hearing aid probably not picking up the distant sound. John set his basket aside and walked briskly toward the store's back exit. The crying grew louder. The evening air was crisp and the setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Behind the store, near the loading dock, stood a large green dumpster. John's heart pounded as the crying became clearer. It was definitely coming from inside. "Dear Lord," he whispered, quickening his pace. His hands trembled as he gripped the dumpster's edge and pulled himself up to look inside. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Nestled among discarded boxes and garbage bags was a bundle wrapped in a thin blue blanket. The fabric shifted slightly as another cry emerged. John didn't hesitate. He hoisted himself higher and carefully reached in, his fingers gently grasping the bundle. The baby couldn't have been more than 3 months old. His dark skin was warm to the touch. Thank heavens he hadn't been out here long. Tiny fists waved in the air as John cradled him close to his chest. "It's all right now, little one," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You're safe." John's mind raced as he hurried to his car, keeping the baby wrapped snugly against the evening chill. He thought of calling the police, but something in his heart told him to go home first. Mary needed to see this, needed to be part of whatever happened next. The 10-minute drive home felt like hours. The baby had quieted, seemingly content in the warmth of John's arms, as he carefully drove with one hand on the wheel. When he pulled into their driveway, he saw Mary's silhouette in the kitchen window. His wife of 15 years, who had cried countless tears over empty nurseries and failed fertility treatments, was about to have her world changed forever. "Mary," he called out as he hurried up the front steps. "Mary, come quick." She appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "John, what's wrong? Where are the grocer—" Her words cut off as she saw the bundle in his arms. Her hands flew to her mouth as John gently pulled back the blanket, revealing the baby's peaceful face. "Oh my God," she whispered, tears already welling in her eyes. Her hands reached out instinctively, and John carefully transferred the precious bundle to her arms. The baby's eyes fluttered open, dark and beautiful, looking up at Mary's awestruck face. "He was in the dumpster behind the grocery mart," John explained softly. "I heard him crying." In the quiet kitchen, a tense discussion unfolded between John and Mary. "This is a white community," Mary whispered, worry creasing her brow as she cradled the baby close. "Where would a black child come from? If we report this to the police, what happens if they don't find his parents? And what if he ends up in the system, shuffled from one place to another?" John ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small space. He could see the fear in his wife's eyes and understood the weight of her words. It was a complex situation, one that went beyond the simple act of calling the authorities. "I don't know, Mary. What if we're making a mistake?" Mary took a deep breath, her voice more resolved as she gently rocked the baby. "Maybe we're supposed to keep him, John. Maybe this child needs us more than we think." John shook his head, hesitant. "We don't even know where he came from. It's too much, Mary." She met his gaze, eyes filled with determination and a hint of tears. "John, God brought him to us. What if we're meant to be his family? After a long silence, John sighed deeply, glancing at the baby's peaceful face. "All right, Mary," he said softly. "We'll keep him." Mary's eyes never left the baby's face as she swayed gently, natural maternal instincts taking over. "This is no accident, John," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "This is God's answer to our prayers. He led you to this child. Our child." Mary filled the kitchen sink with warm water while John gathered clean towels from the linen closet. The baby watched them with curious eyes, now content and cooing softly in Mary's arms. "We should name him Gabriel," Mary said softly, testing the temperature of the water with her elbow. "Like the angel who brought messages of hope." John smiled, laying out the towels on the counter. "Gabriel," he repeated, letting the name settle in his heart. "It's perfect." As Mary gently lowered the baby into the shallow water, supporting his head carefully, her hands trembled slightly. "John," she said, her voice quiet but serious, "you know what people might say. This town, they're not always kind to those who are of color." John grabbed the baby soap they kept under the sink for when their nieces visited. "I know, dear, but love is stronger than prejudice. God brought this child to us for a reason." "Some folks might not see it that way," Mary replied, carefully washing Gabriel's tiny arms and legs. The baby splashed happily, sending droplets of water across Mary's apron. "Then it's our job to help them see," John said firmly. He reached out to stroke Gabriel's cheek with one finger. "Look at him, Mary. How could anyone not love this precious child?" Mary wrapped Gabriel in a fresh towel, holding him close as John went to fetch one of the emergency onesies they kept for the church nursery. "What about the congregation?" she asked. "How do we explain this?" John returned with a white onesie decorated with tiny blue stars. "We'll tell them the truth, that God led us to him, that he needs a home, and that we're blessed to be his parents." He helped Mary dress the now clean baby. "We can introduce him this Sunday. Let them see him as we do, a gift from above." As the evening grew late, Mary sat in the old rocking chair by the window, Gabriel sleeping peacefully in her arms. The moonlight cast a soft glow over them both, and John's heart swelled at the sight. His wife was finally holding the child she'd prayed for all these years. "I'll say a prayer before bed," John said softly, not wanting to wake the baby. "For guidance, for strength, and for our new family." Mary nodded, her eyes filled with love as she gazed down at Gabriel. "Sunday will be here before we know it," she whispered. "I hope they'll see what we see." John bent down to kiss both his wife and new son goodnight, then headed toward their bedroom, his mind already forming the words of the prayer he would offer, asking for wisdom to lead both his family and his congregation through the changes ahead. The Sunday morning sunlight streamed through the bedroom windows as Mary dressed Gabriel in his new white cotton outfit. She had spent hours at the department store picking out the perfect clothes for this important day. Tiny dress shoes, pressed white socks, and a light blue sweater vest that brought out the sparkle in his eyes. Her fingers trembled slightly as she buttoned each pearl button, wanting everything to be just right for their first Sunday as a family. "There you go, my sweet boy," Mary cooed as she smoothed down his collar. Gabriel grabbed her finger and giggled, making her heart melt all over again. She pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead, breathing in his sweet baby scent. In their bedroom, John adjusted his tie in the mirror, his normally steady hands slightly trembling. He had delivered hundreds of sermons over the years, but none felt as important as today's message. His Bible lay open on the dresser, pages marked with notes about God's love knowing no boundaries. Several passages were highlighted in yellow, their edges worn from his repeated readings throughout the sleepless nights of the past week. "Are you ready?" Mary asked softly from the doorway. Gabriel balanced on her hip. The morning light caught the silver cross pendant at her throat, a wedding gift from John that she never took off. John turned to see his wife and son, both looking picture perfect. "As ready as I'll ever be," he replied with a gentle smile. "He looks beautiful, Mary." His voice caught slightly on the words, overwhelmed by the sight of his family. The drive to church was quiet, filled with unspoken prayers and nervous energy. When they arrived, John helped Mary carry the diaper bag while she held Gabriel close. A few early arrivals in the parking lot stopped their conversations to stare, but quickly looked away when John nodded good morning. The gravel crunched beneath their feet as they walked toward the white wooden church doors. The service began as usual, hymns, announcements, and the passing of the collection plate. Gabriel sat quietly in Mary's arms in the front pew, occasionally making happy baby sounds that echoed in the high-ceilinged sanctuary. And the morning light filtered through the stained glass windows, painting rainbow patterns across the wooden floors. Finally, the moment arrived. John stood at the pulpit, his heart pounding. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "God works in mysterious ways, and this week, he blessed my wife and me with a miracle." He gestured for Mary to join him, his hand extended in welcome. As Mary walked up with Gabriel, the whispers started. They rippled through the congregation like a wave, growing louder as people caught sight of the baby's dark skin against Mary's pale hands. The rustle of Sunday dresses and suit jackets filled the air as people leaned closer to their neighbors, whispering behind raised hands. John took Gabriel into his arms, holding him so the congregation could see. "This is Gabriel," he announced, trying to maintain his warm smile despite the growing murmurs. "God led us to him, and we have adopted him as our son." He held the baby closer as if to shield him from the judgment in the air. The silence that followed was deafening. Eyes darted between pews, concerned glances were exchanged, and a few older members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No one spoke directly to John, though their faces said everything their respect for his position wouldn't allow them to voice aloud. As the congregation filed out of the church, John stood in the narthex with Gabriel in his arms, Mary at his side. Mrs. Parker, who had taught Sunday school for 30 years and prided herself on knowing every family in the congregation, was the first to approach. Her lips were pressed into a thin line as she spoke, her flower print dress rustling with nervous movement. "Pastor John, I must say, this is quite unexpected. Have you really thought this through?" Before John could respond, Mr. Peterson, a deacon who usually greeted everyone with a warm handshake, joined them. His hands were stuffed deep in his pockets now, shoulders hunched forward. "Pastor, we're just concerned about what's best for everyone involved," he said, his voice low and strained. "This is a small town, and people here, well, they have certain ways of thinking. Change doesn't come easy to folks around here." John held Gabriel closer, feeling the baby's warm weight against his chest and the gentle puff of his peaceful breathing. "God's love knows no color," he replied firmly, drawing strength from the innocent trust of the child in his arms. "Gabriel is our son now." Several other church members hurried past, avoiding eye contact. A few nodded curtly, but most simply rushed to their cars, their usual warm greetings notably absent. The hollow echo of their departing footsteps seemed to emphasize the growing divide. Mary's hand found John's arm, squeezing it gently for support, her wedding ring cool against his skin. As the crowd thinned, Elder Richardson, who had served on the church board for over 2 decades and had been a pillar of the community, approached with heavy steps that seemed to carry the weight of judgment. His weathered face was stern as he gestured John aside, his silver hair catching the morning light streaming through the windows. "Pastor," the elder began, his voice gruff but measured, tugging at his tie as he spoke. "I've known you since you were a boy. Your father was a good man, and you've served this church well. But this—" He gestured toward Gabriel, who had begun to coo softly. "There are places, organizations that handle these situations. Places better equipped to find the right home for a child like him. You must understand what this means for the congregation." John stood straighter, meeting the elder's gaze while gently patting Gabriel's back. "With all due respect, Elder Richardson, Gabriel already has the right home. He's our son, and we believe he's a gift from God. We won't be abandoning him. Not now, not ever." The elder's face hardened, deep lines creasing around his mouth, but John continued, "I appreciate your concern, but our decision is final. This is what love calls us to do." Without another word, Elder Richardson turned and walked away, his polished shoes clicking against the floor as he left John standing in the empty church with his family. The sound of car doors slamming and engines starting filtered through the stained glass windows as the parking lot emptied, leaving behind a silence that felt both heavy and somehow freeing. John and Mary then went back to their house. Being a creature of habit, John collected the mail from their white mailbox, shuffling through the usual mix of bills and church newsletters as he walked up the stone-lined path to their front door. Among the envelopes, a plain white one caught his eye. No return address, just their names scrawled in harsh black ink that seemed to bleed into the paper's fibers. As his eyes scanned the words, his face darkened like storm clouds gathering. The letter was filled with ugly racial slurs and cruel suggestions about Gabriel, demanding they do the right thing and give him up. The paper shook in his hands as he read it aloud to Mary, his voice growing tighter with each hateful word, the venom in the message poisoning the peaceful afternoon. "How dare they?" he said, crumpling the paper in his fist until his knuckles turned white. "How can anyone claim to be Christian and write such hateful things?" His face flushed with anger as he stood up, pacing the worn carpet, his footsteps heavy with frustration. "This child is innocent. He's our son. God brought him to our doorstep." Mary set down the flowered towel she'd been folding and crossed the room to where Gabriel slept, her movements quiet and purposeful. She placed a gentle hand on their baby's chest, feeling his steady breathing beneath his soft blue onesie. "John," she said softly, "come here." John joined her by the bassinet, his anger melting slightly as he looked down at their sleeping son. Gabriel's tiny fingers were curled into fists, his face peaceful and untroubled by the hatred that sought to harm him. A small smile played at the corners of his tiny mouth as if he were dreaming of angels. "Look at him," Mary whispered, taking John's rough hand in her smooth one. "This is what matters. Not their words, not their hate. God brought him to us for a reason. Every breath he takes is a blessing." John's shoulders sagged as the tension began to leave him, like air escaping from a balloon. "You're right," he said, squeezing her hand. "But I worry about what other cruelty might come our way, what he might face as he grows up in this town." The congregation's whispers are getting louder. Mary led him to the sofa where they sat close together, drawing strength from each other's presence. "Then we'll face it together," she said firmly, her voice steady and sure. "Let's pray about it. Prayer has always shown us the way." They bowed their heads, hands clasped tightly together as John began to pray for strength, wisdom, and protection for their little family. His words filled the room with quiet power, asking for guidance through the storms ahead. Mary's quiet "Amen" joined his as Gabriel slept on, unaware of the storm of emotions surrounding him, protected by the shield of his parents' love. Years passed by, and Gabriel slowly grew up. Although his childhood did not come without challenges, John and Mary always supported their child like he was their own. In the years since Gabriel had joined their family, John and Mary had learned just how deeply prejudice could run, even in a place they once considered a second home. People they had counted on as friends, fellow members of the church, and even some of their neighbors had begun to distance themselves. Subtle shifts at first, polite greetings replaced by cold nods, invitations to community events dwindling, soon became more obvious. Families that once shared meals with them stopped accepting their dinner invitations. Even in church, where they had always found solace, they began to feel a chill. Some congregation members openly questioned their decision to raise a black child in a predominantly white community. A few older church elders, who had once been close to John, now avoided him after Sunday services, their conversations clipped and formal, lacking the warmth they once held. Even some of the younger families who had once looked up to John and Mary as role models now kept a distance, whispering when they thought the couple couldn't hear. At community gatherings, Mary noticed the same pattern. Mothers who used to chat with her about school and neighborhood news now hurried their children away when Gabriel joined in their play. She saw the looks of disapproval, the sidelong glances that seemed to weigh every choice they made. Gabriel remained blissfully unaware of these slights, too young to understand the looks or the hushed conversations that followed them. But the hardest part for John and Mary was seeing people they'd once trusted, people they thought would support them, turn their backs in the face of difference. Each small rejection stung, but they held on tightly to their decision to love and protect Gabriel. One evening before they were about to have a get-together, Mary stood in the church kitchen, along with now 4-year-old Gabriel standing on a wooden stool, carefully stirring the potato salad with a big wooden spoon. His little tongue poked out in concentration, and his dark curls bounced with each determined motion. "Am I doing it right, Mama?" Gabriel asked, his bright eyes seeking approval. "You're doing perfectly, sweetheart," Mary replied, ruffling his hair. She glanced at the spread they'd prepared: fried chicken, green bean casserole, and 3 different pies cooling on the counter. The aroma of home-cooked food filled the kitchen, reminding her of happier times when the church had felt more like family. "Can I taste it?" Gabriel reached for the bowl, but Mary gently caught his hand. "Not yet, Angel. We need to save it for our guests." She helped him down from the stool and wiped a smudge of mayonnaise from his cheek. "Why don't you help me set the tables?" Together, they arranged the fellowship hall, placing crisp white tablecloths and carefully positioning plates and silverware. Gabriel hummed as he worked, completely unaware of the tension that had built up in their church community over the past 4 years. As the scheduled dinner time approached, Mary's stomach tightened with anxiety. She'd sent invitations to every church member, praying this gathering would help bridge the divide that had grown since Gabriel's arrival. The minutes ticked by and only a handful of people trickled in. Mrs. Thompson came with her teenage daughter, both offering tight smiles. The Wilsons, an elderly couple who'd been members for decades, sat in the corner, speaking in hushed tones. 2 other families arrived, but the vast fellowship hall remained eerily empty, the vacant chairs a stark reminder of those who had chosen not to come. Gabriel bounced between the tables, offering rolls from a basket, his innocent smile met with polite but distant responses. Mary's heart ached as she watched some guests shift uncomfortably when he approached, though her son remained blissfully oblivious to their reactions. The dinner proceeded quietly, with only the clink of silverware and occasional murmured conversation breaking the silence. Mary's carefully prepared dishes went largely untouched, and the fellowship she'd hoped to foster felt forced and hollow. As the few guests departed early with mumbled excuses and quick goodbyes, Mary and her husband found themselves alone in the large hall with Gabriel, who was now sleepily arranging leftover rolls into patterns on a plate. They worked silently, clearing tables and packaging untouched food. The weight of their isolation pressed heavily on their shoulders, but when Gabriel wrapped his small arms around Mary's legs and said, "I love you, Mama," she felt tears of both sadness and joy well up in her eyes. A few months passed and winter arrived, bringing a fierce storm to the small town. Winds howled and heavy snow fell, covering everything in a thick white blanket. The temperature dropped quickly, and dark clouds hinted at even more bad weather. Pastor John knew what he had to do. He and Mary quickly turned the church hall into a shelter, setting up cots and gathering blankets, while 4-year-old Gabriel watched the swirling snow through the window, his small hands pressed against the cold glass, eyes wide with wonder. As the cold deepened, people started arriving at the church doors, their faces flushed from the freezing air, snow clinging to their clothes. Among them were some who had kept their distance from John and Mary for years, crossing the street to avoid them or whispering behind their backs. Yet John greeted each person with his usual warmth, helping them shake off the snow and find a place to rest. Gabriel, wearing his favorite blue sweater that Mary had knitted for his last birthday, appointed himself as the official greeter. "Welcome to our warm church," he called out cheerfully to each new arrival, his dark eyes sparkling with excitement and his cheeks flushed with joy. "Mama's making hot cocoa and it's the best. She adds vanilla and everything." Mary set up a makeshift kitchen in the church's small utility room, preparing large pots of soup and hot chocolate that filled the air with comforting aromas. Gabriel insisted on helping, carefully carrying cups of steaming cocoa to the elderly with both hands, making sure not to spill a drop as he concentrated on each step. "Be careful, it's hot," he'd warn with endearing seriousness, his eyebrows furrowed with concern. "But it will make you feel better. Promise." Mrs. Clarkson, who had always been particularly distant, and had once complained to the church board about Gabriel's presence, watched as Gabriel brought her a cup of cocoa, complete with tiny marshmallows floating on top. "I put extra marshmallows in yours," he whispered, as if sharing a special secret, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Because you look extra cold, and everybody needs extra marshmallows on a day like today." Throughout the evening, Gabriel moved among the townspeople with natural grace and kindness, offering blankets, refilling cups, and sharing his favorite storybooks with children his age. He sat cross-legged on the floor with old Mr. Wilson, who had been one of the most vocal critics of Pastor John's decision to raise Gabriel, and listened intently as the man told stories about his own childhood winters, asking questions and giggling at all the right moments. The storm raged outside, rattling the windows and howling through the trees, but inside the church hall, something began to shift. People watched as Gabriel treated everyone like family, regardless of how they had treated him in the past. His genuine love and innocent warmth touched hearts that had been closed for too long, melting away years of prejudice like spring sun on winter snow. When the storm finally began to clear, leaving behind pristine drifts of white, people gathered their belongings to leave. People approached Pastor John, her eyes misty and her hands clutching her worn handbag. "Your boy. He's special," she admitted softly, her voice thick with emotion. "We've been wrong about so many things, so very wrong." Other members nodded in agreement, offering quiet thanks and apologetic smiles as they departed into the crisp evening air. The hate letters that had once arrived regularly at the pastor's home ceased, marking a subtle but significant change in the community's heart. The winter storm had done more than just blanket the town in snow. It had washed away old prejudices and planted seeds of acceptance that would continue to grow long after the last snowflake had melted. Years had passed, and Gabriel had grown into a bright 10-year-old boy who filled the pastor's home with laughter and joy. One crisp autumn afternoon, an unexpected knock came at the door. Pastor John opened it to find his brother Marcus standing there looking somewhat uncomfortable despite his attempt at a smile, his collar turned up against the wind. "John, it's been too long," Marcus said, stepping inside and giving his brother a quick embrace. His eyes immediately fell on Gabriel, who sat at the dining room table working on his math homework, pencil moving steadily across the paper. Marcus's smile faltered slightly and his shoulders tensed as he took in the domestic scene before him. Mary emerged from the kitchen, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. "Marcus, what a surprise!" She welcomed him warmly, though she noticed his uncertain glances toward Gabriel, the way his eyes kept darting back to the boy as if he couldn't quite help himself. "Gabriel, honey, come say hello to your Uncle Marcus," Mary called. Gabriel bounded over with his characteristic enthusiasm, his dark curls bouncing as he moved, extending his hand just as John had taught him. Marcus shook it hesitantly, his fingers barely gripping the boy's small hand, as if afraid of making too much contact. Later, while Gabriel had returned to his homework, occasionally counting softly under his breath, Mary sat with Marcus in the living room, cradling a cup of tea between her weathered hands. "I won't pretend it's been easy," she said softly, watching the steam rise from her cup in delicate spirals. "Some folks still cross the street when they see us coming. We've lost friends we thought would stand by us forever. The first few years were the hardest. The anonymous letters slipped under our door at night, the whispers that followed us through town, the empty pews on Sundays that echoed with absence." She looked up at Marcus, her eyes bright with unshed tears but her smile genuine and unwavering. "But that boy, he's been the answer to every prayer I ever whispered. All those years of emptiness, of wanting a child to love. Gabriel filled that void completely. He's the most precious gift we could have received, straight from God's hands to ours." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the old wood creaking beneath him, his eyes darting between Mary and Gabriel, who was now humming quietly as he worked on his multiplication tables, his small face scrunched in concentration. "The loneliness I felt before, it's gone now," Mary continued, her voice warm with affection as she watched her son. "Every morning when he runs down those stairs, every time he brings me wildflowers from the garden with dirt still clinging to their roots, every night when we read together in his bed, I know we made the right choice. He's our son, Marcus, in every way that matters." That night, as Marcus lay restlessly in the guest bedroom, his mind churned with conflicting thoughts. The ceiling fan spun lazily above him, casting rhythmic shadows across the pale walls, its gentle whirring doing nothing to quiet his racing mind. But deep-seated prejudices ran through Marcus's veins like poison, tainting even the sweetest moments. "That boy needs to be with his own kind," he muttered to himself, running a hand through his graying hair and rolling onto his side. "It's not right keeping him here. Someone must be looking for him. John's just being stubborn about this whole thing." The next morning, over a breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast, Marcus announced his decision to stay a few more days, claiming he wanted to make up for lost time with his brother. Mary beamed, her eyes bright with grateful tears for what she thought was a sign of acceptance, while John clapped his brother warmly on the back, hope evident in his expression. As soon as the family dispersed for their daily routines, John to his study to work on Sunday's sermon, Mary to tend her beloved rose garden, and Gabriel to school with his Batman backpack, Marcus retreated to his room. With trembling fingers and a racing heart, he dialed a number he'd found online after hours of careful research. "Simpson Private Investigations," a gruff voice answered on the third ring. "Yes, I need to hire a private investigator. I want to find more information about an abandoned child from about 10 years ago." Marcus spoke quietly, glancing nervously at the closed door. "A black infant left in a dumpster behind the old grocery store here in Oakwood. He has a crescent-shaped birthmark behind his left ear. I will send you some pictures soon." 2 days later, Marcus's phone buzzed while he was helping Mary with the dishes, his hands deep in soapy water. He quickly excused himself and stepped onto the back porch. "Mr. Marcus?" The investigator's voice crackled through the line. "You won't believe what I found. That boy, he's the son of Robert Chandler. His wife died in an accident, and the baby disappeared without a trace. Williams has a standing reward of $100,000 for information leading to his son's return." Marcus's breath caught in his throat. His hands grew clammy as he gripped the phone tighter, his heart pounding against his ribs. "100,000?" he whispered, already imagining the possibilities. "Yes, sir. The birthmark, location, and age all match perfectly. I'm certain it's the same child." Marcus's eyes darted through the kitchen window, where he could see Mary showing Gabriel how to dry dishes properly, both of them laughing at some shared joke. A slow, calculating smile spread across his face as he ended the call, his mind already formulating a plan. The next morning, Marcus found John in his study, surrounded by well-worn books and papers scattered across his weathered oak desk. Marcus cleared his throat, causing John to look up from his work, the scratching of his pen falling silent. "Brother, we need to talk," Marcus said, settling into the creaking leather armchair across from John's desk. His fingers drummed nervously on the worn armrests. "I've been doing some thinking about Gabriel." John set down his pen with deliberate slowness, his expression wary and guarded. "What about Gabriel?" "I hired a private investigator," Marcus said, his voice carefully measured as he watched his brother's reaction. I thought maybe his real family might be looking for him. Turns out I was right." The color drained from John's face, leaving him ashen. "You did what?" "I know it seems intrusive," Marcus continued, raising his hands in a placating gesture, his wedding ring catching the morning light. "But I thought you'd want to know. The investigator found his father, a man named Robert Chandler from Atlanta. His wife died in some incident and the baby disappeared. He's been searching for his son ever since." John's hands gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning white against the dark wood. A family photo of him, Mary and Gabriel, wobbled precariously near the edge. "You had no right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, trembling with barely contained emotion. "No right at all to go behind my back like this." "I was trying to help," Marcus insisted, leaning forward in his chair, which groaned under the shifting weight. "Don't you think the boy deserves to know his real father? To know where he came from?" "We are his real family," John said firmly, standing up. His chair scraped against the hardwood floor, the harsh sound matching his rising anger. "Mary and I have raised him, loved him, protected him when others wouldn't. We're all he's ever known. We're the ones who've been there for every scraped knee, every nightmare, every birthday. But John. No. John cut him off, his voice steady despite the emotion glistening in his eyes. Gabriel is our son. God brought him to us for a reason. I won't give him up. Not now, not ever. Marcus rose from his chair, his jaw tightening as he straightened his suit jacket. He forced a neutral expression, though frustration burned in his eyes like smoldering coals. I understand, he said stiffly, heading toward the door. I was just trying to do what I thought was right. You have 2 days to think this through. Then I will contact his father, whether you like it or not. He left the study, his footsteps heavy on the floorboards, leaving John standing alone among his books and papers, the weight of this new threat pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. Later that night, Marcus lay in his room mumbling something. Through the thin walls of the old house, Mary could hear Marcus's voice drifting from the guest room. She had gotten up for a glass of water, but now found herself frozen in the darkened hallway, her bare feet rooted to the cold wooden floor. The moonlight filtering through the window cast long shadows across the worn carpet runner. $100,000, Marcus muttered to himself, his voice carrying through the wall. That's what the reward is worth. I could finally get out of this dead-end job, start fresh, maybe even buy that house I've always wanted. Mary's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. The glass of water in her other hand trembled slightly, tiny ripples dancing across its surface. Her chest tightened with each word she overheard. John's too stubborn to see reason. Marcus continued his self-conversation, pacing back and forth. His footsteps creaked against the floorboards, each step echoing like thunder in Mary's ears. But maybe if I contact Robert Chandler directly, arrange something, there has to be a way to get that money. Everyone has their price. Mary's heart pounded in her chest as the pieces fell into place. Marcus wasn't just concerned about Gabriel's welfare. He was after the reward money. The revelation made her stomach churn with a sickening combination of anger and fear. All his recent questions about Gabriel, his unusual interest in their family. It suddenly made perfect sense. She leaned against the wall, closing her eyes as conflicting emotions washed over her. On one hand, the thought of losing Gabriel felt like having her heart torn from her chest. He was her son in every way that mattered, from his morning hugs to his bedtime prayers. But on the other hand, somewhere out there was a father who had lost both his wife and child, who had been searching all these years. A man whose pain she could barely imagine. And then the weight of this knowledge pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. She knew she couldn't keep this information to herself. John needed to know about Marcus's true intentions, his own brother, plotting behind his back. Taking a deep breath, Mary made her decision. She would tell John everything in the morning. They would face this challenge together, as they had faced every other obstacle in their path. With trembling legs, she made her way back to her bedroom, the untouched glass of water still in her hand. The familiar family photos lining the hallway seemed to watch her passage, silent witnesses to her discovery. Sleep would not come easily tonight, but she knew what she had to do. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, casting a warm glow on the breakfast table where John and Mary sat. The usual morning bustle was quieter today. Gabriel was still asleep upstairs, giving them a precious moment alone. Steam rose from their coffee cups, swirling in the golden light as Mary gathered her courage. "John," Mary began, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee mug. "I heard something last night that we need to talk about." Her voice trembled slightly as she recounted what she'd overheard from Marcus's room. John's face fell as he listened, the lines around his eyes deepening with each word. $100,000, he repeated quietly, shaking his head. "My own brother, thinking about selling out our family for money." "That's not all," Mary continued softly. "I've been thinking, maybe Gabriel should meet his biological father, not because of Marcus or the money, but because it's the right thing to do." She reached across the table to take John's hand. "That man lost both his wife and son. He's been searching all this time." John sat in silence for a long moment, his coffee growing cold before him. Finally, he squeezed Mary's hand. "You're right," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. As much as it hurts to think about, Gabriel deserves to know where he comes from, and that man deserves to know his son is alive and well. We're not doing this for Marcus or the reward, Mary emphasized, tears welling in her eyes. We're doing this for Gabriel. And for a father who's been searching for his child, John added, his anger at Marcus softening into compassion for Robert Chandler. It's what Jesus would want us to do. The next morning dawned cold and gray, a fitting backdrop to the heavy atmosphere, as John and Mary waited anxiously in their living room for Marcus to arrive. They had called him early that morning, asking him to come over for an important discussion they couldn't delay any longer. When the doorbell finally rang, John's jaw tightened instinctively as he crossed the room and opened the door to face his brother. Marcus strutted in like he owned the place, his expensive leather jacket and designer watch glinting in the dim light, his confident smirk a stark contrast to John and Mary's somber expressions. "What's so urgent?" he asked carelessly, settling himself uninvited into their favorite armchair and crossing his legs with an air of superiority. "We know what you're planning, Marcus," John said, his voice steady despite the hurt that clouded his eyes. His hands were clenched at his sides, knuckles white with tension. "We know about the private investigator and the reward money." Marcus's smirk faltered for just a moment before returning with renewed force. "So what if you do?" he challenged, lifting his chin defiantly. Mary stepped forward, her hands clasped so tightly together that her fingers had gone white. "How could you do this? Gabriel is your nephew. We're your family." Her voice cracked with emotion, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "I thought you cared about family, not just money." "Family?" Marcus scoffed, his lip curling in disdain. "He's not even your real son. You're just playing house with someone else's kid. Don't try to guilt me with that nonsense." John's face reddened with anger, a vein pulsing at his temple. "Get out," he demanded, pointing to the door with a trembling finger. "Don't come back until you learn that some things are worth more than money." Just as Marcus was about to leave the house, Mary called out from behind, her voice firm despite the tremor of emotion. "Marcus, wait." He paused, glancing back over his shoulder, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, but Mary stepped forward, her eyes blazing with determination. "We've made our decision," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "It's time for Gabriel to know his real father. We don't care about any reward money. We just want what's right for him, and you know that means giving us that address." She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. "So, hand it over, or else." Marcus rose slowly, deliberately adjusting his jacket with exaggerated care. "You want the address of his real father?" He pulled out a folded piece of paper from his pocket, waving it tauntingly in front of them. "You think you can scare me into giving up the address? Think again." He strode toward the door with measured steps, pausing only to glare back at them with cold eyes. "You'll regret this," he muttered venomously, before slamming the door behind him with enough force to rattle the pictures on the wall. John and Mary watched through their front window as Marcus's car disappeared down the street, leaving only a cloud of exhaust in its wake. The silence in their house felt heavy with worry and uncertainty, broken only by the steady ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner. That evening, after tucking Gabriel into bed with extra tight hugs and an extra bedtime story, they sat at their kitchen table, cups of untouched tea growing cold before them. The overhead light cast long shadows across their faces as John ran his hands through his hair in frustration. "Without that address, we have no way to find his biological father. Should we contact a new private investigator like he did?" "Maybe," Mary began hesitantly, tracing the rim of her cup with one finger. "Maybe this is how it's supposed to be. Maybe God has a plan we can't see yet." John slumped in his chair, looking older than his years, the weight of the day's confrontation visible in the lines of his face. "Maybe we are meant to be his only family," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "We can give him a good life even if it means letting go of the idea of the money." Mary reached across the table and took his hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "The money was never important to us anyway," she said softly, squeezing his fingers gently, and John nodded in agreement. They would continue to raise their son as they always had, with love, faith, and dedication, no matter what storms lay ahead. On the other hand, Marcus's car cut through the evening traffic, his knuckles white against the leather steering wheel as he weaved between slower vehicles. The confrontation with John and Mary played over and over in his mind like a bitter movie reel, fueling his anger with each replay. Their self-righteous attitudes, their moral high ground, their endless preaching about doing what was right. It all made his blood boil. He hadn't asked to be the villain in their story, but if they were going to treat him like one, he might as well profit from it. Besides, he reasoned, they'd brought this on themselves with their stubborn refusal to see reason. The downtown area loomed ahead, dominated by the Chandler Building's impressive glass and steel facade that caught the last rays of sunlight. Marcus pulled into the parking garage, straightening his silk tie in the rearview mirror before stepping out into the cool concrete structure. The contrast between this gleaming tower and John's humble church wasn't lost on him. In fact, it brought a small smile to his face. This was where real power resided, where decisions that mattered were made, where money talked louder than prayers. The elevator carried him smoothly to the top floor, its polished brass interior reflecting his determined expression as it climbed past floor after floor of success and influence. When he reached Robert Chandler's corner suite, the secretary barely glanced at him before buzzing him through. Robert Chandler sat behind an imposing mahogany desk, his face etched with lines of experience and loss that seemed deeper in the fading daylight. Family photos decorated the walls in elegant frames, telling a story of happiness cut tragically short. A portrait of a beautiful woman, Emily, his late wife, held pride of place on the wall, her gentle smile forever frozen in time, while a small, worn photograph of a newborn baby sat in a simple silver frame on his desk, its edges softened from years of handling. "Mr. Chandler," Marcus began, settling into the buttery leather chair across from him, savoring the moment. "I believe I've found your son." Robert's expression remained carefully neutral, but his eyes sharpened with interest, like a hawk spotting its prey. "Go on." Marcus explained his investigation in detail, watching as Robert's composed facade began to crack under the weight of hope and possibility. When he finished, Robert leaned back in his chair, his manicured fingers drumming against the desk's polished surface in an uneven rhythm. "Let me tell you what happened," Robert said, his voice low and controlled, though emotion simmered beneath the surface. "Emily and I were taking our son to meet his grandparents. It was supposed to be a happy occasion, a celebration." He paused, his gaze distant as if watching the scene unfold again. The rain came out of nowhere. A truck lost control on the wet road, and then, his voice faltered, thick with memory. "I woke up in the hospital. Emily was gone, and our baby." He swallowed hard, composure slipping. "They said someone took him from the crash site. We searched for years, spent fortunes. Every lead went cold." Marcus listened with practiced patience, maintaining a sympathetic expression while mentally calculating the size of his reward and what he might do with such a windfall. When Robert mentioned the substantial bounty, Marcus smoothly produced the address of John's house from his jacket pocket, accepting the thick envelope of cash without hesitation or shame. Robert held the address like it was made of delicate crystal, his eyes fixed on the written words as if they might disappear. Almost unconsciously, he opened his desk drawer and withdrew an old photograph, its corners soft and worn. The image showed a newborn, peaceful in sleep, with a distinctive crescent-shaped birthmark behind his left ear, a family trait that Robert clung to as proof of his lineage, a mark that would identify his lost son beyond any doubt. He then headed over to John and Mary's house without wasting a single second. The sleek black Mercedes-Benz stood out like an exotic bird among the modest vehicles that lined the quiet street, its polished surface reflecting the late afternoon sun. Robert Chandler's hands trembled slightly as he switched off the engine. Through his tinted windows, he could see curtains twitching in nearby houses, as curious residents caught glimpses of the unexpected visitor in their close-knit village. The piece of paper in his hand, Marcus's hastily scribbled address, had been folded and unfolded so many times it was soft as fabric. the blue ink beginning to fade at the creases. Behind the church, there was a modest two-story house standing like a silent guardian, its weathered white paint and simple architecture speaking to the humble life his son had been living. Robert's Italian leather shoes crunched on the gravel path leading to the front porch, each step bringing him closer to a moment he'd dreamed about for years, rehearsed countless times in his mind. Children's toys dotted the small front yard, a red ball with scuff marks from countless games, a worn baseball glove turned soft with use, scattered wooden building blocks in primary colors. His heart clenched at these signs of a childhood he'd missed, each item telling its own story of laughter and play. The porch steps creaked under his weight as he climbed them, noting the hanging basket of late-blooming purple petunias and the welcome mat that had seen better days, its cheerful message barely legible. Robert's knuckles hovered over the door for a moment before he found the courage to knock, his usually steady businessman's demeanor wavering. The sound seemed to echo in his ears, though it was barely louder than the beating of his heart. Through the door's frosted glass panels, he could make out movement. Two figures approaching, their shapes blurred but purposeful. The door opened to reveal a man in his early 40s wearing a simple blue button-down shirt and khakis. Pastor John, Robert presumed, his face showing the warmth of someone used to counseling others through difficult times. Behind him stood a woman with kind eyes and worry lines around her mouth, her hands clasped tightly together, wedding ring glinting. Mary's presence seemed to radiate maternal protectiveness, her body angled slightly as if ready to defend her home. "Can I help you?" John asked, his voice warm but cautious, carrying the measured tone of a man who chose his words carefully. Robert cleared his throat, suddenly finding it difficult to speak past the emotion constricting his chest. "My name is Robert Chandler," he managed finally, his voice rougher than he'd intended. I believe you're raising my son." He watched as understanding dawned in their eyes, followed quickly by a mix of fear and resignation that made his stomach twist. John and Mary exchanged a loaded glance, years of unspoken communication passing between them in an instant, their shared history evident in that silent exchange. "Please," John said after a moment, stepping back and gesturing inside with a steady hand that belied the tension in his shoulders. "Come in, Mr. Chandler. We should talk." The living room was a testament to the life John and Mary had built together, with its well-worn furniture and walls adorned with cherished family photos capturing moments of joy. Robert perched uncomfortably on the edge of the floral-patterned armchair, his crisp, expensive suit looking starkly out of place among the comfortable, lived-in surroundings. His eyes kept drifting to Gabriel, who sat cross-legged on the soft carpet near the stone fireplace, completely absorbed in playing with a wooden train that showed signs of careful craftsmanship and countless hours of happy play. After exchanging polite pleasantries about the unseasonably mild weather in the quaint little town, a heavy, expectant silence fell over the room. Robert watched intently as Gabriel made enthusiastic choo-choo sounds, pushing the wooden train along invisible tracks on the carpet. The boy's laughter, pure and uninhibited, brought tears to Robert's eyes. I need to ask something," Robert said, his usual businessman's confidence faltering noticeably. He cleared his throat nervously, hands clasped tightly in his lap until his knuckles whitened. "My son. He had a birthmark. Behind his left ear. It's shaped like a crescent moon. It runs in our family." His voice grew softer, almost reverent. "Would it be possible?" John and Mary exchanged meaningful glances, the weight of the moment visible in their drawn expressions. John nodded slowly, understanding the tremendous significance of what Robert was asking. "Gabriel," Mary called gently, her voice warm and reassuring. "Could you come here for a moment, sweetheart?" The boy bounded over eagerly, still clutching the beloved wooden train. Robert's hands trembled slightly as he leaned forward in anticipation. With gentle, almost fearful movements, he tilted Gabriel's head, carefully brushing aside the dark curls behind his left ear. There it was, the familiar crescent shape, exactly as he remembered it from the joyful day his son was born. Raw emotion crashed over Robert like a tidal wave. He stumbled to his feet, turning quickly toward the window as hot tears spilled down his cheeks unchecked. The familiar mark was undeniable proof. This was his son, the precious child he'd searched for through all these lonely years. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass, struggling to regain his composure as his shoulders shook with silent sobs. When he finally turned back to face John and Mary, his voice was thick with emotion and gratitude. "Thank you," he managed hoarsely. "Thank you for taking care of him." The simple words seemed woefully inadequate for the depth of gratitude he felt, but they were all he could muster as he processed the overwhelming reality that his long search was finally, miraculously over. Mary poured steaming tea into mismatched cups, the familiar aroma of Earl Grey filling the air, while Gabriel bounced excitedly in his chair, eager to share his world with their visitor. "And this is my favorite train," Gabriel explained, holding up the wooden toy he'd brought from the living room, his small fingers tracing the smooth edges with obvious pride. "Dad made it for me last Christmas. See how the wheels really turn? They make a special clicking sound, too." Robert leaned forward, examining the handcrafted toy with genuine interest, noting the careful attention to detail in every curve and joint. "That's wonderful craftsmanship," he said softly, glancing at John with newfound respect, understanding the love that went into creating such a gift. "Tell Mr. Chandler about the soup kitchen last month," Mary encouraged, setting a plate of homemade cookies on the table, their sweet, buttery scent mingling with the tea. Gabriel's face lit up, his eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "Oh, I helped serve soup to everyone during the big storm. Some people were really cold, but we made them feel better with hot chocolate too. Pastor Dad let me wear a special apron just like his." As they talked, Robert observed the easy familiarity between the three of them, the way John's eyes crinkled with pride at Gabriel's stories, how Mary unconsciously straightened Gabriel's collar and smoothed his unruly hair, the boys' complete trust in both of them. Each small gesture spoke volumes about their bond, built through countless daily moments of care and attention. "Would you like to see my other toys?" Gabriel asked hopefully, practically vibrating with excitement. At Mary's nod, he grabbed Robert's hand and led him to a shelf in the corner where various toys were neatly arranged, each one clearly treasured. Watching John gently ruffle Gabriel's hair as the boy demonstrated how his toy car worked, making vrooming noises and sound effects, Robert felt an ache in his chest. He found himself wrestling with an impossible decision. His legal right to his son was clear, but the human cost of exercising that right now seemed devastating. The happiness and security Gabriel had found with John and Mary was undeniable, written in every laugh and loving glance. I need some time," Robert finally said, his voice heavy with emotion, his hands clasped tightly together, "to think about what's best for him." John and Mary exchanged understanding looks, their hands finding each other under the table, fingers intertwining in silent support. They knew the weight of what Robert was considering, the magnitude of the choice before him. Standing to leave, Robert straightened his suit jacket, smoothing away invisible wrinkles. "I'll be in touch soon," he promised, his eyes lingering on Gabriel one last time before he headed for the door, carrying the weight of his decision with every step. Robert paused at the doorway, his hand resting on the worn wooden frame, fingers tracing the small imperfections in its surface. The weight of what he needed to say pressed heavily on his shoulders, making each breath feel labored. "John, there's something else you should know." John turned, sensing the gravity in Robert's tone. Mary stepped closer to her husband, her hand finding his arm, her wedding ring catching the late afternoon light that streamed through the window. "It's about Marcus," Robert continued, his voice low and measured, each word carefully chosen. "He didn't come to me out of concern for Gabriel. There was a substantial bounty I'd posted years ago for information about my son. Marcus claimed the reward, a considerable sum of money, in exchange for your address. He approached me with calculated intentions." The revelation landed like a stone in still water, rippling through the quiet room. John's expression shifted from surprise to hurt, then settled into something harder, the lines around his mouth deepening. His jaw tightened, but when he spoke, his voice remained steady though strained with emotion. "He didn't share a penny of that money, but honestly, that's not what bothers me. I just can't believe my own brother would do such a thing to us. We grew up together, shared everything. Robert looked down at his polished shoes, unable to meet John's eyes for a moment, shame coloring his features despite his innocence in the deception. I'm truly sorry. I never meant to be part of any deception. I was just desperate to find my son. I didn't know about the manipulation involved. If I had known, I would have handled things differently. This can't go unanswered, Robert said firmly, straightening his shoulders with renewed resolve. I intend to contact the authorities about Marcus's actions. He needs to face consequences for what he's done. It's the right thing to do. John's expression was pained, but he nodded slowly, his hand covering Mary's where it still rested on his arm. I never wanted this, he admitted quietly, his voice thick with emotion. But maybe it's the only way to move forward. Maybe it's what needs to be done. Robert then went back into his car, eventually going to a distant hotel near the edge of the town, far from the ordinary-looking village he just came from. The next day, Robert lay on the crisp hotel sheets, his eyes fixed on the textured ceiling above. Morning light filtered through the thin curtains, casting gentle shadows that danced across the walls. His mind kept returning to the day's events, each memory as vivid as a photograph, each moment etched deeply into his consciousness. He could still see Gabriel's bright smile, the way his eyes lit up when Mary handed him a cookie, how naturally he fit into the warmth of their modest home. The love in that house was palpable. It lived in every gentle touch, every shared glance, every moment of quiet understanding between John, Mary, and the boy who had become their son. The peaceful atmosphere of their home had touched something deep within Robert's heart, making him question everything he'd believed about what was right. With a deep sigh, Robert sat up and reached for his car keys on the bedside table. The weight of the decision ahead pressed heavily on his shoulders, but somehow the path forward felt clearer in the morning light. His hands trembled slightly as he got dressed and gathered his things. 20 minutes later, he pulled up to the pastor's house again. John opened the door before Robert could knock, as if he'd been expecting him. Mary appeared beside her husband, wiping her hands on her apron, and they welcomed him inside with warm smiles that held no trace of yesterday's tension. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the air. In their small living room, Robert cleared his throat and settled into the worn armchair they offered. "I've been thinking all night," he began, his voice soft but steady. "For years I dreamed about finding my son. I imagined taking him home, making up for lost time. But now—" He paused, gathering his thoughts, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. "Now I see it's not that simple." John and Mary sat quietly on their floral-patterned couch, their hands clasped together, listening intently as Robert continued. The tick of the grandfather clock in the corner marked each passing moment. Gabriel has a beautiful life here. He has parents who love him, a stable home, a community that's learning to accept him, taking him away from all of that. Robert shook his head, emotion making his voice crack. It would be selfish. It wouldn't be what's best for him. Mary's eyes welled with tears as Robert spoke his next words. "I want to be part of his life, if you'll allow it. Not to replace what you have, but to add to it. He deserves to know his history, his biological roots, but he also deserves to keep the family that has loved him so well. Maybe we can find a way to make this work together." John squeezed Mary's hand, and they exchanged a look of relief and understanding. "We'd like that," John said simply, his voice thick with emotion. A warm shaft of sunlight streamed through the window, seeming to bless their agreement. The tension in the room dissolved, replaced by a shared sense of hope and possibility. They all knew the path ahead might not be easy, but they had found a way forward together, united by their love for Gabriel. As they sat there, the sound of children playing drifted in from outside, a reminder of the simple joy they all wanted to protect. If you enjoyed the story of John, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.